Happy little games. Growing up, in addition to loving bowling, I also loved video games. It didn't matter what type of game or for what system, I would play whatever I could get my grubby little hands on. One type in particular I always enjoyed were racing games. I don't know if it was my love for the Batmobile, or Knight Rider, or even the Dukes of Hazzard, but to me, there was nothing better than pretending I was behind the wheel of a souped-up death machine, peeling rubber and taking off down the road. Thankfully, throughout the annals of video game history, there have been absolutely no shortage of racers to sink my crooked teeth into. Today, we are going to take a look at a classic 1989 arcade racer by the name of Ivan Iron Man Stewart's Super Off-Road. This game featured excellent graphics along with smooth animation and, depending on the cabinet, up to 3 simultaneous players. Once again, this is where the gameplay really shines through because the multiplayer aspect is fantastic. While the game is still fun to play in single player mode, racing against 2 other human counterparts and all the trash talking that went along with it was definitely a lot of fun. Instead of trucks, what other vehicles were originally going to be in this game? So put on your driving gloves and pop that clutch. This is the history of Ivan Iron Man Stewart's Super Off-Road. Arcade racing games have been around for a long time. The very first arcade racer was Grand Track 10 and was released by Atari back in 1974. Not only did it feature a steering wheel, but also a foot pedal and a gear shift. There have been hundreds, if not thousands, of racing games released over the years, with some notables being Pole Position, which is what initially I learned to drive on. Outrun. Chase HQ. And the utterly fantastic Hard Drivin'. Atari had a huge hit with their game Sprint and its many variations, but what really set it apart from the rest was the game Super Sprint, which was a 3-player simultaneous top-down racer. The goal is to avoid the various oil slicks and other obstacles and complete 3 laps on each track. There are various wrenches you can pick up which you can use to upgrade the performance of your car. This was such a hit that Atari would release Championship Sprint the same year, which utilized new tracks but only had 2-player co-op to save on valuable arcade foot space. In 1987, game designer John Morgan developed Redline Racer, which was released by Cinematronics, who would later change their name to the Leland Corporation. This is a top-down racer that looks and plays suspiciously like Super Sprint, although not quite as polished. The game mechanics are even similar, allowing you to pick up currency to upgrade your car. Mr. Morgan tried once again to replicate the fun gameplay experience of Super Sprint, only with updated graphics and mechanics. Atari themselves had tried to replicate their own success with the 1989 game Badlands, which was just basically Super Sprint set in a post-apocalyptic world. One major difference though is that your cars had cannons which you could shoot other players in an attempt to slow them down. The game was not drastically different from Super Sprint, and it largely went unnoticed with the general public, although a number of computer ports were released. Mr. Morgan had wanted to create something just a tad bit different but stay true to the spirit of Super Sprint. Off-road racing was something that always interested him, and he decided to swap out the flat, standard racetrack found in Super Sprint for the rough and tumble terrain of hills and sand. Initially, your vehicle of choice were dune buggies, but Mr. Morgan bumped into Mr. Ironman himself, professional racer Ivan Stewart, at a restaurant and introduced himself. Talk soon turned to the arcade game they were developing, and a deal was struck in which the Iron Man would become a consultant on the project and lend his name to it. They would also swap out the dune buggies for trucks. Ivan Iron Man Stewart's Super Off-Road was released in 1989. As the story goes, there really isn't one. You race around the track as fast as you can, trying to come in first place. You have to complete 4 laps and come in first place in order to continue on with your game. As I mentioned, 3 players can compete against each other simultaneously depending on the cabinet. The driving action is fast and furious as you slide around the corners and jump over the hills. At the beginning of the game, you can enter in your initials and birthday, which will allow you to keep track of your best times for each track. One big difference that this game has over Super Sprint is the addition of the Nitro Boost. You do start each game with 20 nitros, but you can buy more by picking up money bags that are littered throughout the tracks. Plus, the higher you place in your race, the more money you will earn. You can use these at the speed shop to purchase extra nitros, tires, which will allow better turning around curves, shocks, which will improve your bounce and takes away the moon gravity from your truck, acceleration, which makes you take off really fast, and top speed, which increases your overall maximum speed. It is possible to add more credits from the get-go to max out the stats of your truck if you choose to do so. After each race, the winners are announced with the top 3 holding a cup standing next to a bevy of buxom beauties. Eagle-eyed viewers will also notice programmer John Morgan as one of the other racers you compete against. There are 99 races to complete in the arcade game, but with only 8 tracks available, they do tend to repeat quite often. The goal of the game is to make it to the end with the most money earned. The 8 wild and wacky tracks you have to compete on are Sidewinder, Wipeout, Big Dukes, Hurricane Gulch, Fandango, Blaster, Cliffhanger, Huevos Grande. To say the game was an enormous success was quite the understatement. As I mentioned, the game was available in literally every arcade I went to back in the day. It was even in other locations such as restaurants and Walmarts, even though the footprint was twice as big as regular arcade games. Later that same year, the company released the Track Pack, which was an add-on kit that featured 8 additional tracks. These were much more difficult than the original game, but it also gave you the option of choosing either the original trucks or the dune buggies that were omitted from the first game. The dune buggies had better shocks and acceleration, while the truck has a higher top speed and better traction. The new tracks you race on are Volcano Valley, Boulder Hill, Redoubt About, Leapin' Lizards, Rio Trio, Pig Blog, Cut Off Pass, and Shortcut. To save on space, the Leland Corporation released a two-player version of the arcade cabinet. The company released a spiritual successor in 1991, swapping out the trucks for Indy cars with Danny Sullivan's Indy Heat. This is a three-player simultaneous arcade racing game with you trying to win the #1 spot. The gameplay is very similar to Super Off-Road, except instead of having to complete 4 laps, you have to complete 8. One unique aspect to this game is that your car will become damaged or low on fuel, which can be replenished by making a pit stop. Cash money is awarded at the end of each race, allowing you to upgrade the various aspects of your car. You can upgrade your brakes, tires, engine, and more. There are even inspirational quotes from Danny Sullivan himself, such as, "Let's burn rubber," which is what I told my girlfriend on our 3rd date. The graphics are really good with well-animated sprites and smooth animation. A number of home conversions were produced and some were very close to arcade perfect. A sequel of sorts was released for the Super Nintendo in 1993 by Tradewest entitled Super Off-Road the Baja. This was programmed by the creator of the original arcade game, John Morgan. The game uses a third-person perspective and based off of the Baja 1000 endurance race instead of the usual dirt track racing as found in the arcade original. This game features similar traits such as upgrading your vehicle with nitros, brakes, tires, shocks, lights, and engine, which you can do before each race. Once again, you are awarded cash money depending on your overall position. Because you are racing for the #1 spot and driving like a crazed pill popper on his way to meet his dealer, you have to watch out for various objects along the way which will incur penalties if you happen to hit them. Quad riders, animals, and even people are littered along the track and you will pay a fine for each one that you hit. Thankfully, if money is no object, then by all means go crazy and mow some people down. There is a handy dandy password feature included as well as a 2-player mode. There are 8 legs of the race to complete, and if you do, you are awarded with a championship cup, and the usual buxom beauties also make their triumphant return. The game is fun to play, although it doesn't come close to the multiplayer madness of the original. In 1997, the official arcade sequel was released, which was Off-Road Challenge. You take your truck on 8 tracks with up to 4 cabinets being linked together simultaneously for some fantastic racing action. You have your choice of different trucks with different starting attributes. This time around, you can choose manual or automatic transmission. There are 6 tracks to choose from, with each one varying in difficulty. These include the Baja, Mojave, Pikes Peak, El Paso, Vegas, and Old South. You can also upgrade your truck at the speed shop with nitros, speed, tires, etc. The graphics are fantastic, although they do remind me of Cruisin' USA, which should come as no surprise as Midway released this one as well. A Nintendo 64 version was also released.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Motorvermogen, snelheid, spanning en sensatie, actie en dramatiek. Het echte offroad racing. Beleef het zelf met Ivan Ironman Stewart's Super Offroad. 4 coureurs in een race op het scherp van de snede. Op je Nintendo. Nintendo, now you're playing with power.
There were a multitude of conversions available starting back in 1990. The first one we are going to take a look at is the NES version. This one holds the distinction of being the only version to allow up to 4 simultaneous human players, which is something not even the arcade game did. You did need the use of the NES satellite or some other third-party contraption to allow 4 controllers at the same time, but this game did support it, and it supported it well. The humble NES does a good job of replicating the original arcade game's graphics, but the animation unfortunately has been sacrificed on the trucks. Obviously, there is no steering wheel, so the controls are a bit iffy, but if you can get used to it, it's a fine conversion for the system. Let's stick with the 8-bit systems and look at the Sega Master System version. The game appears to be running a tad bit slower than the NES version, and the colors appear to be a bit muted, but the controls are more responsive on this version. Also, there are only 2 simultaneous players, but that doesn't take anything away from the gameplay experience. Everything from the arcade game has been brought over, including, as an added bonus, 4 exclusive tracks. The only downside is the music and sound effects, which I found myself muting as I played it. The Sega Game Gear version is probably the best handheld version out there. It does look very similar to the Master System version, although this one does scroll and the trucks are not as smoothly animated. The 4 extra tracks found in the Master System version did not make it over. The AI is also a bit unforgiving at times, and it seems like the computer has an endless supply of nitros. The controls work perfectly fine, and as an added bonus, it allows you to link up 2 Game Gears for head-to-head 2-player action. The Amiga version is one of my favorite home versions of the game. The graphics are fantastic and are very close to being arcade perfect. 416 frames of animation were used on just the trucks alone. Literally everything from the arcade game has been included, from the opening presentation all the way to the celebratory screens. What sets this apart though for me is the music. Any game that has plenty of cowbell is always going to cause a stirring in my utility belt, and this game has it in spades. In my opinion, it's worth listening to the tracks all by themselves. The controls feel great, which pulls it all together as one of the best arcade conversions on the Amiga 500. The Super Nintendo port looks really good, and it actually does a great job at upgrading the arcade game's graphics. The menu and celebration screens have also been changed a lot, whereas the in-game graphics have had their sprites upgraded as well. Since this is a Nintendo game, not only are the girls not in bikinis anymore, but physically they now more closely resemble my 75-year-old 8th grade science teacher. The animation is extremely smooth and the gameplay feels just like the arcade original. The music and sound effects are really good and well worth a look. The MS-DOS version came in 3 flavors: CGA, EGA, and VGA, with obviously the VGA being the best. Thankfully, ad-lib support is included, so we are not harassed by the internal PC speaker. The graphics are very detailed with smooth animation on the trucks and slick, tight gameplay. Everything from the arcade game has been included and is very close to being arcade perfect. Up next is the Game Boy version. This version is slow and plodding, especially when compared to the much superior Game Gear version. Playing this on an emulator 30 years later is bad enough, but imagine playing this on a real green screen, blurry original Game Boy unit. The animation is extremely choppy and the music and sound effects are atrocious. I would rather listen to one of my wife's Dutch ovens than have to endure any more of this. The bad graphics and sounds could be forgiven if the controls were any good, but that's just not the case. The game got fairly good reviews when it was released, so if anybody knows what kind of pot the reviewers were smoking when playing this game, please let me know. The Atari ST version is similar to the Amiga, although it does run slower and the music has taken a slight hit. The game still plays fairly well, although it's not quite as responsive as the other 16-bit computer ports due to the slower gameplay. The Sega Genesis version looks fantastic, although not quite as colorful as the Super Nintendo version. It doesn't matter though, because everything has a more realistic brown look to it, and I always preferred this one as far as graphics go. Audio wise, we do get some fantastic tunes, but they are not quite as good as on the Super Nintendo. Similar though is that everything has been given a fresh coat of paint and in some cases completely redesigned. Whereas Nintendo went in the opposite direction and turned down the sex appeal of the various ladies, this version cranked it up to 11, showing the lovely ladies looking even lovelier. Along with the more realistic backgrounds, we get smooth animation on the trucks. The controls are finely tuned, so if you enjoyed the original game, then you will love this one. The Commodore 64 version is an excellent conversion. The graphics are a bit chunky, which is to be expected on the 64, but the ever-important gameplay and fun factor are present. The animation is smooth and the sound effects and music are really good. You also have 3 simultaneous players, unlike the other 8-bit computer ports. Graft Gold, the company that brought us the excellent conversion of Rainbow Islands, were in charge of this one, so it's no wonder it turned out so good. This is another really well done conversion on the good old Commodore 64. The Spectrum version looks good with nicely drawn, detailed sprites. The problem is, the trucks blend in with the backgrounds and are sometimes hard to make out. It also doesn't help that every truck is essentially the same color, but that was done to keep color clash to a minimum. We do get a fairly decent tune on the title screen and after each race. In-game though, the sound effects are limited to just short, sweet, queefy blasts. The playability is very good and is reminiscent of the arcade original. The last 8-bit computer port on our list is the Amstrad version, which, to be expected, is based off of the Spectrum port. We do get a splash of color here and there, and in-game music. With these bells and whistles though, the speed of the game has definitely taken a hit and everything runs just a tad bit slower. It still plays fairly well, but it doesn't have the same feel as the 64 or Spectrum version. Another version that got good reviews is the Atari Lynx version. Graphically, it looks pretty good, but what lets it down is the slow gameplay and choppy animation. Similar to the other versions, the screen has to scroll so everything is zoomed in, making it hard to see where your opponents are at. The screenshots in the box actually show a version of the game where the screen doesn't scroll, which is a bit of false advertising, and something that computer users were far too familiar with in the 1980s. The game does control fairly well, and it's better than the Game Boy version, but nowhere near as enjoyable as the Game Gear. original arcade game and track pack were also released as part of the Midway Arcade Treasures Volume 3 compilation. These are emulated versions of the various games included, so everything is arcade perfect. This was released for GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox. A Tiger LCD handheld version was also released. Super Off-Road was, and still is, a fantastic arcade racing game. The game is fun to play by yourself, but it really shines when there are 3 people racing against each other. The best way to play this is on an actual arcade unit with the steering wheels and pedals. So if you happen to see one in the wild, drop a quarter and enjoy the ride. You'll be glad you did. If you like this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Thank you all so much for watching.